don't get an offer. You're not just interested in money, but this year we are. So I think that will be hopefully good. Today, a talk by Mathias Poertner, our guest today, who I would think is the new star. I'm not saying rising because he has already risen in comparative politics. So in German, I would say Senkrechtstarter. But then I looked it up and I'm like, okay, so the English translation for this is vertical takeoff aircraft. That doesn't really sound as nice, right? So, but you know what I mean? Like fast trajectory. His work is being talked about in seminars online, and everyone admires his creativity. Remember, he is part of the team where the researchers hired, I think, students or actors?
Students.
Students.
We trained as actors.
Who were actors, who had to act as actors, who would casually or seemingly lose a bag of lemons on the train platform to have other researchers or students to count how many of those people around them would actually help the person to collect those lemons. And the key question in this article was, is there a difference in such helping behavior, you know, our key dependent variable, if I may say, do we cooperate with each other? Do we help each other? Whether this person is a visible religious minority or not. So that's pretty creative. This is just one of many of the ideas Dr. Poertner, who is now an assistant professor at LSE, has written about, and you can find a collection of such studies in his book, although it's not even his latest book, but his book from 2022, I think. Mm-hmm. Native Bias, Overcoming Discrimination Against Immigrants, which of course is also a book that won the Best Book Award by the Experiment section of APSA. This should not be his only award. I think I have yet to find something you do, Matthias, that didn't get an award. So if that ever happens, so please let me know. He regularly publishes in first-rate journals such as APSR, several times, AJPS, several times, GOP, CPS, political analysis, and many more. Amongst others, he received the Gregory Libert Award for Best Article in CP, the Sage Best Paper Award for APSA papers, and several best articles published in journals. And I think also to mention the Jack Walker Award for outstanding research and achievements in the area of political organizations and political parties. So, having been trained at Berkeley by Ted Dunning, amongst others, he's always on the lookout for some randomization in our world. In fact, today he will talk about such a treasure that he apparently stumbled upon, a lottery for representation by a party in Mexico. And he has written several articles on it. He is summarizing some of this research for us, but also talks about a new dimension of his work, which has not been published yet, being based on this fantastic data set. So I hope, and now I also see our political theorist who works on lotteries here in the room, so that's another exciting meeting point here. I hope you look as much forward as I am to this talk, and let's welcome Dr. Poertner to the CSTC. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dietlind, for this very kind introduction, and thank you very much also to you and Frederic for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to share two projects with you today. One is a recent article, and the other one is a new project on how political participation and representation of marginalized communities influence their political participation and ability to overcome barriers to participation down the road. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, perfect. In recent decades, as we all know, democracies across the globe have adopted policies to empower underrepresented constituents and to promote their representation in elected legislatures. However, it remains unclear whether improved political representation actually increases political engagement among those represented, and how it affects political parties that are trying to promote more representation in this context. to the extent that prior research has engaged with these questions, the empirical evidence is rather mixed. While some historical studies in the US have documented a positive effect of descriptive representation on political engagement, numerous more recent studies in the US and beyond find no evidence that representation of, for example, race, ethnicity, or gender breeds more political participation by those represented. More importantly, most of this research work, most of this recent work on descriptive representation focuses on descriptive representation of ascriptive characteristics, often a single ascriptive characteristic such as race or gender. And those highly visible characteristics are certainly very important. I don't want to disagree with that. But representation, as to quote Pitkin, standing for by resemblance, can also rely on less visible shared experiences and relations. When we go back to some of the earlier work on representation, we actually find a broader understanding of descriptive representation than what we encounter in the literature today, at least in the empirical literature on the topic today, that go beyond individual ascriptive characteristics and instead emphasize the importance of shared experiences and being part of local networks. And in this paper, in the first article that I want to talk about today, I developed this idea further and put forward the concept of embedded representation, which I define as representation by representatives who resemble their constituents in terms of their social background, but not only in terms of that, but also by being part of local social networks. So, for example, in the form of organized civil society at the local level. And I argue that such embedded representatives are particularly effective at empowering constituents and mobilizing political participation. To test this argument and to overcome the challenge that the extent to which certain communities are represented politically is usually driven by their past representation and participation, I present evidence from one of the rare instances in contemporary history in which a random lottery was used to select candidates for national elected public office. In Mexico, where most voters are relatively poor and do not feel represented by their mostly upper class representatives of the traditional parties, the recently founded Morena party has extensively used lotteries to select candidates for elected office. This party, which contested its first election in 2015 and won the country's presidency and both chambers of Mexico's Congress of the Union in 2018, selects 2/3 of its party list candidates for national deputies, for national legislators, through publicly conducted lotteries from among local level activists who, unlike traditional deputies in this context of other parties, closely resemble their constituents in terms of the broader social background and that are part of local organizational networks. I'll say more about that in a second. The lottery system is a rather complicated system. I can go into more detail in the Q&A, but through these lotteries, citizens in some localities making up about 9% of the Mexican electorate at random received political representation through one of these lottery deputies from their locality by virtue of the randomized list rank of those candidates. So the lottery effectively assigns elected deputies to some municipalities, which I use as a treatment group in my analysis, and non-elected candidates to other municipalities, the control group for the analysis. And this allows me to estimate the marginal effect of having a lottery deputy in office from a certain locality at time t on voter mobilization, the same locality at t+1. I discuss this in more detail in the paper, but there's very little potential for sorting here. These lists are closed, and the constituencies for the party lists are rather large and, in fact, composed of multiple states, which makes it less plausible that an individual candidate's effort in this context, in the campaign, for example, would actually be large enough to make a difference or ensure that they will be victorious in this context. This is the first election which this party participated that I focus on here in 2015. So they had relatively little information about expected support in different parts of the country, and actually outperformed the limited data that we had from survey research at the subnational level in many parts of the country. And unlike in most other mixed electoral systems, Mexican voters do not cast separate ballots for deputies elected in the PR tier, but instead the seat allocation is based purely on the SMD vote in this context. So this is important to understand why the list rank actually determines whether you end up in office, and the list rank is randomly determined in this context. Through dozens of information requests and a lawsuit under Mexico's general transparency law, I reconstructed the randomization procedure for the lotteries conducted in 2015. This is the first time the party ran candidates and the first time they used lotteries, and connected them to electoral results in the subsequent 2018 general elections. And I also assembled very detailed biographic information on the candidates and conducted interviews with many of these lottery deputies and candidates to better understand the mechanisms at play here. Just really quick, in terms of balance, the candidates who were elected and those who were not are very similar with regards to the characteristics that they provide on their registration forms. But more importantly, the municipalities in treatment and control. So the constituents who lived in municipalities that by virtue of the lottery ended up being represented by one of these elected deputies, compared to the constituents who lived in municipalities who had a candidate on the list who did not get elected by virtue of their randomly determined list rank. Those municipalities are very similar with regards to a bunch of pre-treatment covariates, sociodemographic, political nature, etc. And to account for slightly different assignment probabilities across municipalities, I use inverse probability weighting for all the estimates that I'll show you today. And in the paper, I also replicate these analyses with alternative estimation strategies, which yield virtually identical results. So what's the effect of representation on subsequent political participation in this context? First, I found strong evidence that electoral participation in subsequent elections is significantly higher among constituents who had been represented by these lottery deputies. They're about 1.9 percentage points more likely to turn out. And in line with my hypotheses about vote choice that I discussed in the paper, I find that the party responsible for this increased representation, Morena, was rewarded by represented constituents in the subsequent election quite handsomely with an additional 5.1 percentage points support, even though these deputies themselves could not run for re-election under Mexico's electoral law. So it's an important point to keep in mind. So this is not an individual incumbency story here. At the same time, other parties with a similar platform, most importantly the PRD, obtained less votes among represented constituents than among those in the control group, which might suggest that Morena was able to mobilize new voters on the one hand, but also win over voters from its main competitors among represented constituents through this representation. What's interesting is that Morena gains electoral support in particular municipalities that are also represented by another deputy from the same municipality. So when comparing constituents who are also represented by another federal deputy belonging to another party from the municipality to those who are only represented by the lottery candidate, we can observe that the Morena vote share is significantly higher among constituents who are also represented by this other deputy. So this might point towards the importance of perceptions of relative performance in this context. When constituents have the direct comparison between the representation provided by a lottery deputy and a traditional deputy, they're particularly likely to reward the party in the next election for the representation provided. In the paper, I then go through a number of different potential explanations for these findings, and I show that, for example, hometown candidate effects or pork barrel politics cannot account for these results. There's no effect, for example, of just having a lottery candidate on turnout in the municipality unless they're actually elected and represent the constituency. There's no evidence suggesting that merely running a local candidate increases participation. So maybe you might think that this increased political participation is the result of pork barrel politics or improved substantive representation. So if this were the case, we would expect, or we might expect, that more federal resources are spent on constituents in represented localities. And while patronage politics are widespread in Mexico, the specific context in which the lottery took place, I would argue, offered a little opportunity for these deputies, these lottery deputies, to target resources to their home constituencies. There are no discretionary funds similar to CDF funds, which some of you might have encountered in contexts that you study. At this point in time, the party did not have a majority in the legislature and did not have executive control, small number of deputies. They didn't have any senators elected yet, and they were in strong opposition to the presidency at the time, to the president at the time, and they held no control over state governments, which in Mexico are quite important if you want to funnel funds from the federal government to localities. And I also show that there's no difference in terms of the amount of non-formula based federal transfers received due to lottery representation. And here again, it's also important to keep in mind that these lottery deputies could not run for re-election under Mexico's electoral laws at the time. To further test whether constituents in municipalities represented by lottery deputies might still perceive improvements in substantive representation, for example, as a result of increased credit claiming by lottery deputies for investments in local public goods, one could imagine that, or by helping constituents to access discretionary state programs, such as housing subsidies or business grants. To assess that, I look at additional survey data that measure such attitudes within the population. And here I use geocoded survey responses from the Latin American Public Opinion Project, LAPOP, which were collected about 18 months after the lottery deputies took office. So that's about halfway into their term in office. So about 18 months after they took office and about 18 months before the subsequent election took place in 2018. And I find that constituents represented by lottery deputies do not appear to be more satisfied with the quality of local public goods than those without such representation. They might even be slightly less satisfied in some areas. So they did not secure additional funding for their constituents. And their constituents did not perceive improvements in their living conditions. But maybe lottery deputies were better advocates for the constituents based on the legislation that they advocated from the legislature. To assess this possibility, I examined their legislative behavior by analyzing roll call votes during the 2015-2018 legislative session. But I find that lottery deputies do not appear to behave any differently in Congress once elected in terms of their voting behavior compared to deputies selected through traditional selection procedures for the same party. And in fact, lottery deputies voted in line with the majority position of their party 97.3% of the time, just like the other parties, like the party's other deputies. So what can explain these patterns? Let's take a look at who these deputies actually are. First, as I show in the paper, these lottery representatives, unlike traditional deputies, more closely resemble their constituents in terms of their broader social network. So if we look, for example, at the educational background, this is the educational background of constituents who are represented by lottery candidates. We see that the vast majority of the population has at best primary education or middle school education. Some have graduated from high school. Very few have gone on to higher education. If we look at the educational background of these types of party list candidates by traditional parties, down here, this would be the 85% of the population over here. So we have a very strong upper class bias if we proxy for class by education in this context. If we look at the lottery deputies, Higher education is still slightly overrepresented. These are undergraduate degrees. These are specializations beyond that. But we do have candidates who only hold primary school education, only attained middle school education, or some high school education. If we look at the occupational background of constituents and the representatives as another proxy for class in this context, we see a very similar story where in this context, a large part of the population is part of the informal sector or does not hold formal sector employment, which is something that if we look at the occupational background of deputies, traditional deputies, the pan is in blue, the verde in gold here. We see that there's a strong upper class bias again in terms of the occupational background of traditional deputies in this context. And these lottery deputies do look a lot more like the population in terms of their occupational background. We do have people who are part of the informal sector. We have these are just the elected deputies. We see a very similar picture if we look at all the candidates. We see people who are day laborers, which obviously is a large part of the constituents, but not something that was represented at all in Congress. Furthermore, most lottery deputies are involved in local organizational networks, such as local independent labor and peasant unions, and drawing on interviews with these deputies, I document in the paper that these organizations generate crucial connections with popular class voters, increasing the representatives' visibility and providing information about how constituents are being represented by someone like them in this context. All right, so that's why I've shown you that constituents who have been represented by a lottery deputy are more likely to participate politically in the future, and that these deputies closely resemble their constituents in terms of their social background and are embedded within local organizational networks. And while all of these lottery deputies more closely resemble their constituents in terms of their social background than traditional deputies, some of them are still more similar in terms of class background to the majority of the constituents and others. And when I explore this variation in the class background of the deputies, I find that the increase in electoral participation is driven by constituents represented by a lottery deputy with a lower class background. At the same time, participation among constituents represented with a highly educated deputy, which some of them do have higher education as a proxy for class in this context, is not significantly different from the control group. Similarly, I find that the representation by a deputy who has particularly close ties to local organizational networks and held leadership positions in local civil society organizations prior to assuming office leads to more electoral participation. So that's the difference between the blue and the red bar here. In the next step, I try to further test this empowerment hypothesis that representation by these embedded representatives should increase political efficacy and support for political institutions. And to do that, I again use geocoded survey responses from LAPOP, which were collected about a year and a half, as I said before, after the lottery deputies took office. And I find that constituents who received embedded representation at random developed a stronger sense of political efficacy and expressed more support for the country's political institutions in this context. And news consumption shows a similar pattern. When analyzing data on Google searches, for example, I find that constituents in localities with a lottery deputy became much more interested in topics related to congressional representation than constituents in the control group in this context. Beyond those municipal level effects, we might also expect that empowering effects are particularly pronounced among individual constituents who share the same social background as the embedded representatives. And to test that, I estimate the effect of lottery deputy representation on individual level attitudes among constituents who are part of this LAPOP sample. And I find that these effects seem to be particularly pronounced indeed among constituents with a lower class background as proxied by education. If you look at the interaction term here. And among previous non-voters. So this is mobilizing people who did not, or this is disproportionately mobilizing people who did not participate in the previous election 2015. Last, I turn to census data and find a similar pattern when looking at the effects by communities' poverty levels. So this observed increase in electoral participation is particularly pronounced in localities with larger income vulnerable population shares. Whereas these constituencies are usually much less likely to participate electorally than their fellow citizens in richer localities. Representation through lottery deputies from their community actually boosts their participation and closes this participation gap in this context. So the main takeaways from this first article are that embedded representation empowers constituents and increases their political representation, their political participation, and is rewarded by voters. The party making these efforts is handsomely rewarded. But additional questions arise in this context. If we want to understand whether this representation provided actually leads to subsequent changes in the representation provided in subsequent elections, we need to understand how important these initial political experiences are for the career advancement, the career development of politicians. And I think it's particularly interesting to think about the role of gender in this context, because by virtue of the lottery, let me back up. Party lists need to be, same as SMD candidates in Mexico, need to be gender balanced. But often for SMD candidacies in particular, women are placed in constituencies that are less likely to be electorally successful. So even though candidates are often roughly balanced in terms of gender, deputies are not. With the lottery, the randomization is blocked by gender. Every second randomized position is for the opposite sex in this context. So if the first position is assigned to a woman, the second position is assigned to a man, and so on. In this context, the randomization ensures that women have an equal shot at getting nominated and getting elected. So we can then also think about what happens when women candidates have an equal chance to gain political experience. How does that affect their subsequent career advancement? Here is a stylized overview of what these party lists actually look like. As I said before, the first two positions in the party list are always randomly assigned. So the first two positions are randomly assigned. The third position is assigned in a sorry. Okay. I'll just stay here.
It's the random element.
Exactly. I might have to start drawing or something. The third position is assigned in a non-random fashion. These are highly recognizable candidates that are signed by the party in a different way. I ignore them for the main analysis because they're not randomly assigned. And then we have again another triplet like this, two randomly assigned candidates, non-randomly assigned candidates, and all the way through to the end of the list. And through a coin flip, the gender for the first position is randomly decided. The second position goes to a candidate of a different gender. In this context, gender is constructed as being binary by the party organs. And through that, we end up with 50% women candidates, 50% men candidates. So to look at the career advancement of these candidates, some of whom end up in elected office, let's say this list draws all the way to position 15 or something like that. That means that the first 2/3 of the 15, so 10 randomly selected candidates end up in office, the remaining ones do not. So I can compare the career advancement of those who gain this political experience by virtue of their randomly determined list position to those who do not. To do that, I used the data I used for the other paper and also added additional information on the 2018 elections, which is the second time the party used lotteries. So I coded the registration information for all party list candidates for that election. Look at the returns for the elections of 2018 to see who was actually elected, and compile a data set that contains registration information on all candidates for elected office in Mexico after beginning in 2015 for all national, state, and municipal level elections. And then combine that with information on the election returns for these subsequent elections with lottery candidates to see whether they were victorious or not. So when I trace these candidates from 2015, 2018 in the subsequent elections to see whether they are renominated for something else. And let me remind you, under Mexico's electoral laws, they could not stand re-election for the same position, but they could be renominated for something else. They could be renominated for another position at the federal level, maybe a senatorship or an SMD candidacy. They could be nominated for a position at the state level or at the municipal level. When we look at that, there seems to be, I'm still cleaning the data a little bit, there might be a little bit of an effect on being renominated, but it's not a massive effect. You might be slightly more likely to be renominated, but you're much more likely to win the election. So if you have gained political experience at random through the lottery, your chances of being victorious in a subsequent election are 10 percentage points higher, which is quite a lot in this context. When decomposing this by gender, we see a very interesting dynamic. This result is almost exclusively driven by women candidates. There might or might not be small boost that men candidates get in this context, but women candidates, if through the lottery they gain this initial experience, they're much more successful afterwards in elections. And this seems to be driven, or this might be an indication that there's both a bottleneck issue problem going on here. Parties are often not as willing to nominate women for promising positions in this context. In this case, that's no longer an issue. They have the opportunity to gain this initial visibility, and if they do, they're much more likely to then also be successful in subsequent elections. And there might also be a voter dynamic going on here, where if once voters see that these women candidates were successful or have the experience, they are then much more successful in subsequent elections. So let me just talk a little bit about the implications of these two papers. I think these findings have important implications for the political representation of historically marginalized groups. First of all, the results suggest that access to an initial seat at the table can be crucial in empowering those represented and in promoting their future representation. And the study also, the first study also shows that the inclusion of grassroots candidates, activists, who might lack the political experience of career politicians, but have shared experiences with popular class citizens, can be a very effective strategy for political parties to mobilize voters in this context. And as trust in established parties has decreased in democratic regimes in recent decades across the globe, more inclusive and more representative candidate selection procedures, of which lotteries are arguably one example, these kinds of more inclusive, more representative candidate selection procedures represent an important way in which parties might be able to gain or regain trust and support from voters.